Welcome. A religious teacher came to Jesus one time with a question. What is the greatest command among all the commands? And Jesus told him, the greatest command is to love God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. And the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. These are the two most important ones. And of course, these are the two most important because they include all the other commands from God. And they are related together because loving God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength means we'll also love our neighbor as ourself, because our neighbor is God's creation. What's unique about the message of Jesus is that this command to love God becomes like an invitation. Jesus came to teach us that the creator of the universe is inviting us to come to love him, heart, soul, mind, and strength. And not only that coming to love God is a journey. It doesn't happen in a moment, in a short passage of time. It's a journey to come to love him first with all of our heart, then with all of our soul, with all of our mind, and then with all of our strength. And Jesus taught that this journey is a transformation too, because as we come to love God, we are changed into God's image, to love as he loves. The Apostle Paul one time talked about this transformation in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 18. There he said that we are all being transformed into the image of God with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. This transformation is with ever-increasing glory. It's a process. It's like a journey that happens loving God first with our heart, then our soul, then our mind, and our spirit. And Jesus also gave us a map to help us understand how this journey would develop. And that map is included in one of the most famous parables that Jesus taught, the parable of the lost son. And we'd like to read that together. And with that parable, begin to think about what it means to love God with all of our hearts, because this really is a parable for our hearts. I'd like you to turn with me to Luke chapter 15, and we're going to begin reading with verse 11 to read this parable. Jesus said, "There is a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got all together he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went out and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring a fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, 'What was going on?' 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. You never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." It's a beautiful story. It's a story of transformation and how a young man comes to love his father in a way that he had never loved him before. And to understand this parable and understand what it has to do with our own personal transformation, let's raise some questions about what happens. First of all, what would cause or what would motivate a son to come to his father and demand his inheritance before his father had even died? One time I raised this question in a class that I was teaching in a jail, and one of the young men in the class, who had been accused of a very violent crime, said, "Selfishness." And he was right. It was selfishness. Selfishness is putting ourselves in the center and thinking about what we deserve, what will make us happy, without thinking about the needs of anybody else. We are the most important ones, and everybody is here to serve us. We're at the center. There's no room for compassion, mercy, or kindness towards others. In this young man's mind, when he came to his father and demanded his inheritance, he wasn't thinking about what his father felt or how his father might react. He was only thinking about what he wanted, what he thought would please him. And so he had decided to live outside of his father's house, and he wanted his inheritance. But the next question that occurs to us is, why did his father give him this inheritance? Would you do that for your son if your son came to demand his inheritance from you? Well, the father was not ignorant. He must have known his son. And what he knew about his son was that he didn't have his son's heart. That his son must have loved him, but loved him for what he received from his father. He wanted his son, the father wanted his son to learn to love, truly love. And to do this, he had to give the son the choice he needed to make. And so he gave him his inheritance, gave him the possibility with the resources to leave if he wanted to leave, with a hope that he would learn how to love out of a free choice. And so not long after the father gave him all the property that was due him, half of what he owned, the young son must have liquidated it, sold the land, sold the cattle to have the money himself, and he left to a far country. Left everything behind, including his father. Why would he go to a far country, though? Why not go to another neighborhood close by or another city close by? Well, in such circumstances, one's conscience must bother oneself. He must have known something about his father. He must have known something about how his decision would not be agreeable to his father. And to soothe his conscience, or to remove this conflict from his conscience about what his father wanted and what he wanted, he would have to get far away from his father, as far away from his father as he possibly could, to a place where he wouldn't have to think about his father, where he wouldn't find anybody who knew his father, to avoid this inner conflict. And that's what he did. Selfishness drove him away from his father. Selfishness drives us away from love. And when he gets to the far country, he begins to spend. He spends all of his money in uncontrolled, wild living. The next question that comes to us is, why not be careful how you spend it? Why not take the money and invest it in new property and new cattle and make a living for yourself and prove yourself responsible? Why spend all of your money in wild living? But this is really the direction that selfishness takes us, because selfishness is always about what will please us, ourselves. And he was foolishly wasting his money trying to please himself, trying to satisfy something inside of himself, trying to fill some emptiness that could not be filled in such a way. He was certain that spending his money this way would bring him happiness. We do lots of things that we are certain will bring us happiness, when in reality they won't. They only bring us destruction. That's what happened in this case. Soon he was out of money. And as soon as he was out of money, another tragedy happened there in the far country. A famine came to the land. A famine because perhaps there was not enough rain, the harvests were not sufficient, and because of insufficient harvests, there was not enough food, not enough work, and he began to be hungry and in need because of the famine. What did the famine reveal about this young man? Well, first of all, undoubtedly, he was suffering like he had never suffered before. Perhaps he had never experienced this kind of suffering, certainly not in his father's house, where he had everything he needed. And he had always tried to control his life so that he would receive the kind of pleasure he wanted and live the way he wanted to live. And now he was experiencing something outside of his control that was making him hungry and making him understand how empty he really was. What the famine revealed in him to himself was that he was not only empty in his stomach, he was empty in his spirit too. But he thinks he can recover. So he finds a job. He finds a job from a citizen of that country, feeding pigs. Now this must have been the most horrible job that he could imagine having. He was a Jew, and the Jews had nothing to do with pigs. They didn't eat pork. And this must have been the most dirty job he could imagine of having. And as he was feeding those pigs, he began to think, and his heart began to change. This was not what he wanted to do, and this is not who he wanted to be, a servant feeding pigs. And as he looked at those pigs, maybe it reminded him of the greed and ambition of the people who lived in that country. And maybe the greediness of those pigs feeding and never being satisfied reminded him of himself. And he began to think differently. Something began to change deep within his soul. And Jesus says he came to his senses. He came awake. He suddenly realized some things he had never realized before. And every lie that he had told himself, everything that he had deceived himself into thinking, suddenly was revealed. Every lie for being a lie and every deceit for being deceit. He understood now that the decision he had made to come to this far country was the wrong decision. He begins to think about his father now. And he begins to think differently about his father. Before, being a son meant to receive what his father had. Now, he begins to think about who his father was, what kind of person he was. He begins to think about the servants in his father's house, and even the servants had enough food to eat. That wasn't true where he was living. Where he was living, the servants ate last, even after the pigs. But in his father's house, his father was so generous that even the servants had abundance of food. So he thinks he's going to return back to his father. He's going to tell his father that he had made a big mistake, that he had sinned against heaven and sinned against him, his father. And please make him now like a servant. He didn't think he deserved to be a son anymore. Why didn't he feel like he was worthy to be a son? He's thinking that he's going to tell his father that I've sinned against you. I want you to think about what that means. Because the word that Jesus used, that's translated sin, means to miss the mark, miss the target. And to sin against his father meant that he had missed the target for being the kind of son he should have been to his father. In his thinking, to be a son meant to receive what his father had, to get what his father could give him, what he deserved as a son. But now he's thinking differently about his father. Now he wants to be a son who is the image of his father. And to be a son in its true sense means to be in the image of our father, to be like our father. He had missed the mark. He wasn't like his father, but he wanted to become like his father. His mind now was changed. So he decides to go back. What gave him the courage to go back? The kind of person his father was. He must have known that his father was generous and gracious enough to at least receive him back as a servant. So he gets up and he leaves. And while he is coming to home, and while he's still a long ways off from home, his father begins to see him. And what his father sees is something much different than what his father had seen when the young man left. Now the son was dirty from feeding pigs. He was skinny from not eating enough. Didn't have any sandals on his feet. Maybe he even looked older. And Jesus says that the father was filled with compassion. These words are most important. It reveals something very deep about the father's heart. He understood his son's suffering. He understood how his son was suffering emotionally. And so because of the compassion he had for his son in that moment, he ran to him, threw his arms around him, hugged him, kissed him, and brought him back home. His son says to him, just as he had planned to say, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. Please just make me a servant." And the father, instead of making him a servant, restores him to be a son again. He tells his servants, "Quick, bring new clothes for him. Bring a ring to put on his finger and sandals on his feet, and kill the fattened calf, because this my son who was dead is alive, and who was lost is found." There is no recrimination. There is no resentment. There is absolute forgiveness, mercy, and graciousness. He restores his son to be a son again. Now, another character enters the scene, the older brother. Jesus takes us out to the fields where the other brother is working, and as the brother comes in towards the house in the evening, after having worked in the field, he hears all the noise from the celebration, and he wants to know what's happening. So he asks a servant, and a servant tells him, "Your brother has returned, and your father is celebrating. He's killed a fattened calf." And when the older brother heard this, he was furious, and he refused to go in. When the father heard that the older son had come close to the house, he goes out to the older son to entreat him to come in. He's just as patient and compassionate and accepting of his older son as he had been of the younger son. And the older son complains, "I have been slaving for you all this time in the fields, never disobeyed any of your commands, and you have never given me even a goat to celebrate with my friends. And this son of yours, when he returns after wasting all of your money in wild living, you have a celebration. You kill a fattened calf for him." On the surface, what the older son might have made sense to him, what the older son was saying might have made sense to him, because he didn't understand what kind of person his father really was. That's amazing to me, is that he had been in his father's house all this time. And he really didn't know his father. The reason why he didn't understand why his father was forgiving his younger brother is because he didn't understand how gracious and compassionate and merciful his father was. Maybe the older son, too, had thought that being a son means to get what your father gives you, to receive an inheritance, too. He had never come to understand how gracious and merciful his father was until this moment, when he sees how his father treats his younger brother. He didn't understand. He didn't know how to love like his father loved. He was in the same situation, the same circumstance as his brother was when his brother left. So his father begs him to come in because he says, we had to celebrate because your brother was dead and is alive now. He was lost and now he's found. In this brief story is the story of our own transformation, how we come to love our Heavenly Father, heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love him like we've never loved him before. And in the following studies, we're going to begin to think about this journey of transformation, starting with our hearts and how we come to love God with all of our hearts. This is the story, the journey of transformation, and it's a journey that takes us closer and closer to the Father, step by step, as we are transformed into his image, and we come to love as he loves. May God bless you.